Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time poor but enthusiasm rich primary teachers. This week on the podcast, I'm delighted and honoured to say that we are joined by the Right Honourable Sir Nick Gibb. So, Nick, it's wonderful to have you here. Thank you very much for joining us.
It's my pleasure, Kieran. Thank you for inviting me.
Listeners to the podcast will, I think, in the main, have developed as teachers throughout your tenure as Minister for Schools. And so I think we'll be really interested to go deeper into some of the key ideas in your new book, Reforming Lessons, which I know is released sort of towards the end of the summer. Is that right?
Released on the 11th of August.
Oh, fantastic. So actually quite soon. And so, I mean, I think probably it makes sense to start with a bit of background. From reading Reforming Lessons, your journey into politics seemed to culminate perfectly in your role as schools minister. And for me, arguably one of the most effective, impactful, and living memory. If you were
Thank
to
you.
look back, was there a defining moment or turning point that set you on the path to 2010?
Yes, I mean, I came into politics initially. I'm a chartered accountant. Always taken a great deal of interest in economics, and and I came of age in politics under Mrs. Thatcher, and I was a great supporter of hers and Ronald Reagan. I believed in the free market and what free enterprise can do in terms of wealth and for the nation and so on. And and those were the big issues of the 1970s when it was in my teens, and so that's what drove me into politics. I felt very strongly about those issues, and I was elected to Parliament in 1997. By that time, I felt actually, and I became a shadow Treasury Minister, I became a shadow Trade and Industry Minister. But then I felt that in the early noughties that we'd actually won that debate, that monetarism was the way countries control their excess demand and so on, rather than fiscal policy. So I felt that debate had been won, and I was sort of so my second issue, if you like, had always been these ideas in education. I'd been to school between 1965 and 78, during which time we had all the Anthony Crossland reforms from the mid 60s, and we saw progressivist ideology creep into schools. Although I was only a kid and really didn't totally understand what was going on, because I went to seven different schools, including a school in Canada, because of my father's job as a civil engineer. I kind of took an interest in what was happening in schools, and so I've always felt there were ideas there that needed exploring. And so when I sort of thought, well, there's enough already on the economy, I then decided I wanted to focus on education. I went on the Education Select Committee, and then in 2005, I asked Michael Howard, who was the leader of the party then, if I could come back on the front bench. I'd taken myself off for a few years, and he said, "What as?" And I said, in education." So from 2005, then I was an opposition spokesman for the party in Parliament on schools. And then I started visiting schools every Monday up and down the country to try and understand why we were declining in those international league tables, PISA and TIMSS and Pearls. And that really set me on the road to really trying to understand all the different philosophical and ideological debates that were happening in education.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, because what a time to be elected to Parliament, because you had quite a long time then to really get to grips with the brief.
Yeah. So we were 13 years in opposition, 97 to 2010, and 5 of those years I focused on education and opposition. And also in 2004, I think the book talks about this in a bit more detail. I met Ruth Miskin because I knew my researcher had helpfully identified the Read and Reform Foundation. We had hit upon the reading wars, and I knew that was an example of the debate between progressivist education and what I like to call evidence-led education. Some would term it traditional or neo-traditional, is what John Blake likes to call it. And so I hit upon the reading wars, and then Ruth introduced me to the Clackmannanshire study, and so I learned all about that study that took place in Scotland and the dramatic impact on the reading ability of those primary school children, 7-year longitudinal study. So that was a turning point. And then I went on a 2-day course of how to teach reading. So really understood some of those issues.
One thing that really leaps out from the pages of reforming lessons is almost your remarkable attention to detail. Where do you think that comes from, and how did it influence your approach to policy making in education?
Well, two issues really. I didn't really go into politics, uh, which I think most people didn't in those days. It's changed in the last 20 years, but I didn't go into politics to be on the TV and to be famous. I went into politics because I was driven by ideas, by battling against bad ideas and the way the country should be run, and trying to promote and sell really good ideas and the way I thought the country should be run. So that was what motivated me. And therefore, if it's ideas that motivate you rather than climbing the greasy pole, you have to get into those details if you want to make the argument, hone the argument, persuade people, and make sure that you have your own understanding. I always say to people that want to go into politics, young people, and they want to have a discussion about how they do it. I say you've got to know what you think before anything else. Read, 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 so you know what your own beliefs are. Then you're able to go into politics. So there's that. And also I spent my early part of my career at KPMG, or Pete Marwick Mitchell as it was when I joined it in 1984. Most of your listeners won't have been born then. And So I was 13 years as a chartered accountant with KPMG. And, there you had to, attention to details determine whether you survived or not in that career. So I learned how to be a professional, if you like, at KPMG. And I took those skills into politics. And I did pride myself on attention to detail. I read everything, and when we took legislation through the House of Commons, whether it's primary or secondary legislation, I had read every clause, comment, dot of that legislation, because that's what you're trained to do at KPMG. Because when things go wrong, you don't want them to go wrong because, oh, I hadn't bothered to read that section. So it was my mistake that there's something's gone wrong. I know that if anything's gone wrong, at least I know that I have done everything I could possibly have done to prevent it from going wrong.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I think, like you say, you notice that transition in sort of the political sphere. Like you say, perhaps it is part of the television is a more important part now than it used to be. But also, I don't think you arrive at a lot of the conclusions that evidence informed practice or evidence informed teaching sort of suggests without really going and spending a lot of time with it, because quite a lot of it can be counterintuitive at times. When I think about the work of David Dye and reading his Wrong book, I had to read that 3 times before I thought, okay, I can get over my biases, my sort of sense of liminality with my time at school and that kind of thing. So that makes absolute sense. In the early 2010s, you and Michael Gove were sort of, it appeared to me, to be the first who were engaging with what we call teacher bloggers. People like Andrew Old, Daisy Christodoulou, whose ideas at the time weren't necessarily mainstream. And now, some people have claimed you were platforming those who already agreed with you, but even before reading reforming lessons and having watched things play out in real time, that doesn't really feel accurate. How did you form your views on education, and how influential were those blogs in shaping them?
They were very influential. I mean, I had an instinct about what had been going wrong because of my own childhood experience in those 7 schools, good ones and weak ones. And and then I spent my 5 years really learning and reading and coming to a view. So I had by 2010 come to a very firm view about what I thought was the problem with our education system, why it was declining internationally, and how I thought, based on that reading, it could be put right. So they are right, the critics, in saying that I had a preformed view, but it wasn't a preformed view based on nothing. It was based on having read Hirsch and Willingham. And then people like Andrew Old were terribly influential in the sense that they helped us navigate the system. I had always assumed that Ofsted was doing great work in our schools, identifying underperforming schools. So I never thought Ofsted was going to be a problem until people like Andrew Old highlighted the issue. Um, And then I realized that they were actually the enforcers of bad practice, unevidenced practice. So there were another element of the establishment that was doing things that were damaging children's education. So they were terribly important in terms of informing us about what was going wrong. And of course, Daisy's book, Seven Myths, which initially, of course, it wasn't a book; it was it's a website thing, a thing on the precursor of Substack type thing, and again, it was succinct, and it's again it added to what I'd already read in Hirsch, um, but in a very compelling way, based on some of it based on Ofsted reports and so on. So they all those people were absolutely critical in moving our thinking on. Now, did I read people who didn't agree with me, but probably less so because, um, as a conservative, I would read conservative philosophers and as an economist and as somebody who had come to a very firm view about uh, education and the damage that certain ideologies were doing. I was more interested in people that shared that outlook, and then I could learn from their more advanced thinking about those issues than I would be reading, going back to fundamentals, trying to work out what I believed in, because I had already done that reading by the time he came into office in 2010.
The enforcers of the progressivist ideology, that really resonates because I find at the time, having started teaching, that sort of approach to teaching made more work for the teachers
Hmm.
than perhaps the ideas of Daisy. The book that really stands out with me with that Daisy wrote was Making Good Progress,
Mhm.
where we looked at how our approach to assessment and the amount of time that could save teachers just by thinking more deeply, pun intended, about the way we approach things. And so I think if you take all those sort of contributors together, what you have is almost like a subtractive process where you're being more effective, but actually you've got more time to think about the things that are really important in education.
No, absolutely. One of the things that I'm most proud of my 10 years as a minister and what we've left behind, having left office, is that there is a teaching profession now that has the confidence to read and challenge that I don't think happened before. And I think it was important that we had Michael Gove and me in the department because I think if Daisy had written her book and Andrew Old had written his blogs, they would almost be sort of spitting in the dark, if you like, without that sort of cover to, and the fact that Michael would refer to Andrew Old in his speeches and so on, I think just helped amplify and give credibility to the very sensible things that Andrew Old was saying and Daisy was saying in her when she first wrote Seven Myths. So I think that, and all that I think then led to the what I call the liberation of the teaching profession. Um, I talk about the secret garden of education policy that Callahan was in 1976 was criticised for entering. How dare he talk about education policy? This was the preserve of education professors. Even teachers weren't allowed in the secret garden. I think we've taken away not just the gate, but the fence around the secret garden. And in that garden now, and it's almost unique to England compared to other countries around the world, that teachers are blogging and writing prolifically. They're attending research ed conferences founded by a teacher, Tom Bennett, is now a global institution. Um, and the things that people are writing about, that teachers are writing about, like podcasts like this, I don't think that they would have taken off, but for this liberation, because you'd worry as a teacher. I know you out of teaching for a couple of years, but there are podcasters who are teachers, and they'd worry if what they were saying on their podcast contradicted the prevailing orthodoxies of their local authority. And we've taken schools, if you like, away from those local authorities through the academies program. And teachers now are free to think. And there's some of the things that they're writing about now exceed the expectations that Michael and I had initially. They're much thinking is greater, the creativity of what they're proposing, their analysis of things like behavior and pedagogy and teaching methods and how the children learn cognitive science it's like a renaissance of in intellectual activity within the teaching profession, which I think is is a unique to this country, but it's also a wonderful thing to behold. So I think that yeah, I mean those that thinking I think is really hugely important in pushing up standards in our schools.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I've spoken to teachers in other parts of the United Kingdom who feel they don't have the opportunity, for fear of reprimand and things like that there. And, I think I went to my first research ed in 2016, 2017. And it was then that I was sort of starting to realize that actually maybe there was a place for primary teachers to have these conversations on that scale. And so, and this really resonates with my own personal journey. And our regular contributors are all classroom teachers, and it's very much a case of we want to talk about the things that work, the ways we can make life better. We imagine teaching to be a 45-hour a week job if we think smarter rather than harder and that kind of thing. And so I think having the opportunity to have these discussions, it can't be overestimated.
It's something that happens in other professions, dentists and accountants. They will have these, I mean, not as interesting discussions, frankly, but they attend conferences about how to do things better in their own professions. And I think what's happening in education is, I mean, it's interesting and it's thriving and it's creative, and I think it's really important. And I think we're going, as you know, we're going up England's education as opposed to the other three nations. It is going up. We're fourth in the world in pearls in the reading ability of 9-year-olds, and we've gone from 27th in PISA in maths to 11th, and I think it's going to go further up because this self-improving system has not just halted. It's like a flywheel, and it's continuing to motor. And I think we'll see those numbers increase further. I think we'll go further up in the league tables of maths and literacy and hopefully science.
Certainly hope so. I mean, we often refer to it as the golden age because we've never really known as much about how teachers develop and as much about how children learn. Or certainly, some of these ideas are 50, 60 years old, but they've never been part of the discourse. And so I
Which
think,
is extraordinary, isn't it? You think this research, a lot of it has been around for a while, and yet it hasn't changed practice. And now it is. And of course, it didn't change practice in the United States. That wonderful podcast by Emily Hanford, Sold a Story, I mean, that came out in 2022, explains the scandal of the way reading was being taught in America's schools. And we'd already, I think, dealt with this issue, if you like, in 2012 and probably 2010 and 9 as well, actually. But so for years, this research has been around, and yet America is plowing on, continuing to teach reading in a way that would hinder struggling readers. But I think now, yes, I do think that I think now people do feel more confident. Teachers do feel more confident to challenge prevailing orthodoxies, which is a good thing. And I don't even mind, when people challenge me, it's fine. I don't claim to be the fount of all knowledge. I'm just pleased when teachers have back control of their profession.
I was fortunate enough to be part of one of the first groups of math specialist teachers to visit
Ah,
Shanghai. I think it was 2014.
right.
Liz Truss had just been out as she was trade minister at the time, or certainly involved in that
Yes.
ministry. And we're given a fact finding mission. What happens in Shanghai, and there were 50 of us, I think, come back and tell us all about it. And one of the things that really struck me, and I'm pretty sure this was on the very first morning, so 13-hour flight, put in a room with some of their sort of senior ministers. And I was struck by the decade by decade planning. So they outlined 86 to 96, 96 to '06, and then they were almost at the end of '06 to 16. They had this clear strategic arc. Now, I accept that it's a one-party state in many respects. Do you think education policy in England suffers from being too politicized? And should we perhaps insulate it from some of the short-termism of party politics?
Well, look, we live in a democracy, and you take the rough with the smooth. I mean, democracy is, as Churchill said, is the worst possible system of government, except for all the others. And I mean, I'm happy that I live in a democracy, and I will fight to defend it every day of my life. particularly at the moment when people are very critical of the political process. So I think democracy is important. And if you have a service funded totally by the state and taxpayers, inevitably it will be political. However, I do think that the ideology of education did not come from the political system. It came from within. And it's what an academic I met recently called the paradigm cartel, and it applies to every profession where one view dominates, whether it's, medicine, whatever it is. And if you don't adhere to that orthodoxy, you're kind of prevented from promotion or employment. And I think this happened within education. There's one view of progressivism, and which always sounds compelling. The word progressive sounds compellingly good. Um, and it does sound good that you're teaching skills of, intellectual skills to children, of creativity, problem solving, critical thinking, what's not to like. The problem is, and that you don't get those skills from the methods that they're suggesting by teaching them directly. You become a problem solver by knowing a lot of maths. So those ideas did not come from the political system. So there wasn't the Labour view was progressive and the Tory view was, evidence-led, traditional. It came from the professors of education in the faculties and this paradigm cartel of a particular viewpoint dominating. And it's not just dominated here, it dominated in America and Australia, New Zealand as well. So, but it did take politics to kind of undo that, to release it, to stop this spiral and domination of one particular view. And that's what Michael, if you ask me what was the greatest achievement of Michael and I say it was that we stopped this dominance by that one ideology, and we allowed a thousand flowers to bloom, to use Mao's phrase, but also Michael used it. And that's what the Academy's program was designed to achieve, and it's what the standards agenda, which sounds very prescriptive, you shall teach phonics, but the purpose of it was to allow teachers to teach some in a way that they had not been allowed to before because of the dominance of this ideology. So I would say that it isn't the party political process that has led to these debates, the reading wars, etc. Those battles were happening within the profession, and in my judgment, evidence-led approaches to education had been pushed out in a sort of Gresham's law, where bad ideas were driving out good. People complain about the kind of topsy-turvy that you get one government in and they believe in this, and you've got Blunkett, and then you got replaced by. Um, there was actually quite a bit of consistency between the Blair administration and David Cameron's. But the topsy-turvy will stop once the profession has come to an established view about what actually works. So, for example, in economics, which is what brought me into politics in the first place, um, there was this debate between monetarists and Keynesianists about how you regulate excess demand in the economy and sort out inflation. And I was always on the side of monetarism, but now monetarism is accepted worldwide. I mean, most people think that if you have too much inflation, you raise interest rates to reduce the money supply, and that's established. So there isn't that topsy-turvy conduct now of economic policy. There are shocks we have to deal with: banking crash, COVID, Trump. But in terms of prescription, we're now pretty settled. And the stop-go policies we had in the 70s and earlier, that they don't like. I think we'll get to the same point at some point in education where the evidence is so overwhelming that phonics, systematic phonics, is the best way of teaching reading, that the East Asians do have the right approach to teaching mathematics step by step, slowly teaching the algorithm, make sure there's plenty of practice, fluency in the procedures, and with that, a deep understanding of the mathematics, the arithmetic that children are learning, and that knowledge, teaching knowledge, which sounds unnecessary in an era of Google and AI, but these arguments were being made in the 1920s about always look it up in encyclopedia. You don't need to drill these kids full of knowledge and crushing their creativity. These ideas are not new. But I think ultimately people will realize, on the basis of Daniel Willingham and other cognitive scientists, that if you want young people, not our adult population, to be critical thinkers and problem solvers and to be creative. You only get those skills from having a lot of knowledge of humanities, of science, of math, of literature and great music. That's how you become creative. You can't compose. I went to see the latest version of Evita in the Palladium on Friday night, and it was just astonishing. I saw the original version of Evita, which was also astonishingly wonderful. It's one of my favorite musicals. But the version in the Palladium was just better, even better than the original. It's just so creative. The music's brilliant. It was brilliantly performed. The dance and choreography was wonderful. That choreographer who who wrote the music, the dance for Evita, they just didn't come to that not having learned anything about dance in the past. They had, immersed themselves in music and in other dances that other choreographers have written in the past. So that's how you become creative. You can't just say, well, today's lesson is creativity, and let's learn to be creative. It's just that. And I think in time, we're not there yet. I think in time that those arguments will be settled by overwhelming evidence.
We're looking for a critical mass. And I think things like the Education Endowment Foundation and the Early Career Framework slash changes to ITT, those are the kind of things, do you think, that'll push the critical mass towards the sort of the maintenance of these effective approaches? Is that sort of the thinking behind that?
Yes, I mean, the Education Endowment Foundation was important. It's something we had wanted to. We discussed in opposition having a What Works Centre based on the centre in America, because I was always kind of saddened by the quality of research that was coming out of the universities. And it would say things like, we tried this new approach and 75% of teachers thought it was brilliant. Therefore, this approach is brilliant. I mean, that isn't research. That's an opinion poll. Research is, we tried this thing in this class, and in this other class, we did something, we didn't do anything. That was the control group. And it happens that the class where we did this new thing, their results are 12% higher than the class that we didn't. That's randomized controlled trial research. And the Education Endowment Foundation, we gave them £137 million over 10 years to spend with interest. They could spend it over 10 years. They were conducting more randomized controlled trials. I think they were conducting 10% of the world's randomized controlled trials in education. So, and the quality of their research. And then they also analyze existing research and give it sort of categorize it in terms of quality. I think that has been hugely influential. And we now have a similar organization in Australia, the Australian Education Research Organization, AERO. These are really important in making sure that the quality of educational research is high, and also that it's accessible to teachers. Sometimes you read this, academic stuff that comes out. I can't understand a word they're writing sometimes. I'm not an academic, so maybe that's why, but I don't think very many people can understand what they're writing. Whereas the stuff coming out of the EEF, is meant to be digestible for teachers, busy professionals. So I think now the quality of evidence that's available for teachers to look at is great. Plus, of course, we've got all these teachers, very clever teachers, writing their own blogs and analyzing it. The Carl Hendricks of this world who will tell you something is nonsense. So it's great. So I think we can be much more reliant now on the quality of the research that people are reading and talking about.
Yeah, I think plenty of teachers will have the same issue when trying to read almost intentionally obtusely written
Yes.
pieces. People like Carl, maybe Tom Sharrington, David
Mm.
Dye,
Yeah.
certainly in the early days of my career, those are the people who I would go to as sort of guiding lights because they were making this stuff really accessible. And so I can totally, I can see that. And, I think with the Education Endowment Foundation, in my opinion, has sort of gone beyond what Works Centre, because I spent a lot of time on that website as well. And I think actually having people like Sam Sims, Jonathan Sharp was sort of was it not collating, but almost I've lost the word, but they're sort of shepherding us towards
Yeah.
places we should be spending our attention, because as teachers, it's finite.
Yeah, we're quite lucky in this country as well. I mean, we inherited a system when we came in 2010. We had the 1988 Act, And then we had the 92 Act, people forget about. And the 92 Act, the 88 Act says there's got to be all these SATs and end of primary school, key stage two assessments and so on. The 92 Act said they're going to be published on a school by school basis and the GCSEs, which meant we had this vast treasure trove of data about how schools were performing. The schools published the proportion of children that were reaching the expected standards in primary school, and then we had a similar figure for the GCSE results. What the figure was changed over time, 5 or more, A to C, and then 5 or more, A to C, including English and math, and then we had Progress 8 latterly. But all that data is, hugely important in demonstrating that the different approaches schools can take and which are succeeding and which are not. So that's really helpful in terms of understanding the effectiveness of evidence, which other countries don't necessarily have. Some do, but not every country. And I think that, and we didn't have all the controversy of having to implement that when we came in 2010. That was already in place. It came in with a Conservative government, but it survived and was improved by the Blair administration and Andrew Adonis, who brought in the suffix including English and maths, which I think was hugely important. And then David Laws actually was the person that brought in the Progress A's, Liberal, in the coalition. So that's something an advantage we had in 2010, and it meant that we really could see what was working and what wasn't working.
The next question is almost a bit of a selfish one because it's something I always think about. And during your time in office, there was a real emphasis on coherence in curriculum, assessment, phonics. But one piece that never landed, in my view, was a national textbook. I'm thinking particularly of mathematics and phonics, but could apply across the board. Were we ever close to such a reality? And was the decision to stop short of where the Singaporean and Shanghai model / example sort of ends? And was it a case of free market economics, education principle, or perhaps something that I'm not considering?
Well, I think it was market failure, actually. I mean, I made a number of speeches about textbooks. We had an international textbook seminar. We tried to, I mean, I think our textbooks, apart from the ones at Key Stage 4, but even they're designed for passing an exam. They're not really what I would call a proper textbook in the sense that you can read beyond the syllabus. But they're the best we have. But lower down the school, they're terrible. And we've got this really good science curriculum in primary that I suspect is more honoured in the breach in most primary schools. It's very difficult to teach because it's full of knowledge, the taxonomy of flora and fauna, and and so on. It's very, very knowledge rich. And if you are not a geography graduate or a science graduate of some form, you'll struggle to teach that without a really good quality textbook, which don't exist. And it really infuriates me that we don't have good quality textbooks coming from our publishers. And I challenge them every time I meet them. And the discussion always ends in a row. And they're obsessed by wanting to get all this stuff online. But children need books to learn from, however inconvenient that is for textbook publishers, which astonishes me why they don't want to publish books. So there's something wrong with the market. And when we did have this, as you say, we did have this system. I mean, it's difficult in a democracy, I think, to have a national textbook. It kind of goes against the British grain in a way that the government will have a textbook. So we prefer the market to produce things as well, and schools to have a choice. But we did try and do something with maths, as you intimated, and we had a panel. We had a set of criteria of what would be a good. This is Tim Oates helped us with this, and we ended up with 2. We made a few publishers a bit crossed they didn't get through the system, and then we sort of gave match funding to schools to buy this textbook, but the pricing of the textbook was so high that it just didn't take off. So again, I think it's market failure. If you get the pricing right, you can sell more books, and I don't understand why they had to be so expensive. So I still think this thing needs resolving. This is something I don't think we succeeded in achieving. And you are right that a coherent curriculum is not just about the drafted document that you can find on the website from the DFE. It's also about the lesson plans and the use of textbooks and what's in them. We have the lowest use of textbooks in the developed world in terms of our country's pedagogy. It all goes back to an ideological opposition to textbooks in the 70s. A lot of textbooks were thrown out of schools, particularly primary schools, and the worksheets and this sort of weird view that teachers should spend hours creating lessons every year, which I think is not a good use of professional time. So it's not yeah. So this is an area that I wish we had been able to be more successful in, and I still am engaged in this debate. Love to find a publisher that wanted to produce really high quality material based on oak, based on what the EEF says works. That I think they would sell a lot of books.
The pricing really resonates because when I spoke to teachers in Shanghai and when I spoke to teachers in Singapore, they were talking about how the pupil books were costing, 43 cents.
Wow.
They were using, so it was an affordable model for those schools. But having used textbooks, we in my last sort of full-time schools, we used a textbook, and you were talking maybe £5,000 outlay at the start, and then maybe 1,500 a year after that, and that's not affordable for all schools.
I've never understood really. Again, it's all a money raking thing for the publishing industry. Why we have to have those workbooks printed. I mean, I hate people who say, "Oh, when I was at school," but when I was at school, we had textbooks that we were issued with every subject at the beginning of the year, and you had to go and cover them with brown paper, paper to protect them. And then if you look inside the dates, I started school in 1965. Some of the books I was reading were 1945, John Smith. So they were perfectly fine. Of course, knowledge changes, but some things don't change. Most things don't change. Photosynthesis doesn't change. An interpretation of King John might change, but those reviews of the history are not necessarily important for 8-year-olds and 9-year-olds. So I think we could use textbooks year after year. I don't think they necessarily need to change. And that's, again, we need to just make sure we're not. One thing I didn't want to do when we did the curriculum review, there was a sort of view previous governments that you should change the curriculum every 2 or 3 years. And I was always against that. And I used the phrase once that teachers need to be able to laminate their teaching plans, which got criticized. But they shouldn't have to keep revising what they're teaching every year because of new curriculum that comes from the system. As I say, photosynthesis doesn't change. Osmosis is osmosis. Let's just teach those things in the most effective way, and not keep. So we were very clear that the curriculum review that we started in 2011 was going to be a big one, but we were not going to then change it after that. And we incurred a little bit of political flack in the years after that when we said no to people who wanted to put this or that into the curriculum. We said, no, it's done the review, it's going to be settled. So we don't want teachers having to rework everything.
No, not at all. I mean, up until very recently, we were still calling it the new curriculum.
Yes. I mean, it does take a long time to implement a curriculum. We started the curriculum in January 2011. We started with primary, then we moved on to secondary GCSEs. And some of those GCSEs didn't really come in until 2017. Some of the smaller subjects with examinations in 2019. So it does take a long time when you've got to write the thing, you've got to consult, you've got to give the school lead time, you've got to give exam boards lead time and so on. So it does take a while. But I think this kind of permanent revolution in curriculum, I don't think is the best, is the way to get the best out of teachers or the school system.
Yeah, and touch wood, it sounds like Becky Francis and her team who are conducting the current review are aiming to build. We will get to what the future holds, but my initial impression is that even though they've got quite a broad brief, they're going to build on what's come before.
The interim report was encouraging that it wasn't aiming to just throw the baby out with the bathwater, which is good.
A relatively late example of that consistency was the introduction of the multiplication check in year 4. This is probably just for me. I don't think its execution has lived up to its promise. I was really pleased to see it come through. I took part in 3 of the pilots. One was during COVID, or certainly during the first year of the pandemic. And I thought this is going to be a really good thing for schools. How do you reflect on it now? And is it something that can still be salvaged if we accept that it has a lot to live up to the success of the phonics screening check?
Well, I'd be intrigued to know a bit more about your concerns, but I I don't necessarily take that view, but I like to hear your arguments. But when I first started visiting schools in the sort of 2005 to 10, and I did ask children in year 6 their tables, and some hands went up, but not every hand went up. And now when I visit schools, every hand goes up, including the tough ones, which I think are like 11 11s and 11 12s. All the hands go up. So I think just the notion of that this was coming, and we changed the national curriculum to bring it to 12 times 12. It was 10 times 10. Now it's up to 12 times 12. We brought it down from year 6 to year 4. And the fact that multiplication tables check was on its way, I think. And I remember going to schools and having a little bit of a heated discussion with some head teachers. Said, "Do you not teach the tables?" "Oh, yes. Here, look." And I went into a class and they weren't learning the tables. They were going 3, 6, 9, 12, 15. That is not learning your tables. But if you look at the results of the phonics check, when it first became, and the reason why we didn't come to it late, actually, we came to it pretty early on, but it took years to develop. And the government is not the best provider of computer-based services, and I did not want this thing to go wrong. It had to go right first time. So we did spend a lot of time developing it, and that's one advantage of being in office for a long time. You can see something like that all the way through. And we piloted it, and we piloted it, and then it was ready to go universal. And we had COVID, and we said it's available to everybody, but it's not compulsory. And then in 2022, it was compulsory. And then in that year, the average score, out of 25 questions, the average score was 19.8, and 27% of youngsters got it 100% correct. And then it went up, so that 27% went up to 29%, and then last year it was 34%. I don't know what the figure is this year, but I think this is good. I think a third of children in a pressured environment, and some of those people who didn't get 100% got just below because they got their fingers wrong on the keys or something. I think children now in our primary schools, they leave there, they know their tables, and that was not the case. You talk to secondary school maths teachers who say that the vast majority of kids came in not knowing their tables, which makes simplifying fractions and algebra that much more challenging. But anyway, I think it's been a great success. I would love to know why you think it was disappointing.
All right. I mean, maybe I'm being unduly harsh, but I think there are arguably 37 unique facts that we need to learn, and like you said, they unlock the rest of mathematics in year 5 and year 6 and beyond. And I would be hoping that that percentage would be closer to 95% of pupils. And
Right.
I know it's high pressure, but I think the selection of 6 seconds is really important because having watched pupils do it, you can see that 6 seconds is long enough to type in an initial answer, think about whether you've got it right, and then change it if necessary. But if you're counting on your fingers or skip counting, it's not long enough.
Hmm.
And so, in terms of how the check is formulated, I can see how it distinguishes between those people who know and those people who don't. But I think if we look at the 20, and I think the last time I checked my own local authority, it was 17 was the average sort of response. Because of the way the check is weighted, it's those times tables that children really need to know but don't know that I think are the 5 that they're not getting. It's your 7s, 8s, your 9s, perhaps your 12s. I mean, there's an argument maybe the 12s aren't as difficult as this scene. And so from my perspective, with the phonics screen check, you've got such a huge proportion of sort of pupils who are ready for that next stage in their reading journey. And I think we've still got a little bit way to go until we're ready for this, for instance, the work with fractions in year 5. If you don't know your 7s, 8s, and 9s, that's sort of where I'm coming from.
Really, I mean, that's really interesting. What you're saying. I think my instinctive response is that it's probably because there isn't enough weight attached to the multiplication tables check. I mean, I sometimes speak to MPs and they've never even heard of it. And I mean, ideally, both the multiplication tables check and the phonics screening check will be an accountability measure that's reported on a school by school basis. But I just knew I would never get away with that politically with the unions and so on. I just couldn't afford to have it boycotted. Had it been so, though, I think it would have had more salience. Both, I think the phonics, even the phonics screening check disappoints me. It's 82%. Well, why isn't that 95%? Why isn't it 99%? It's 92% by year two. So we can at least get to 92 by year one. I think you make a point. I think we could just get this thing reported more. And I don't know how much weight Ofsted attaches to the multiplication tables check. It does attach, I think, quite a bit of weight to the phonics screening check. So I think accountability will help focus schools more on this than before. But having said all that, I say to people that being a minister, a policymaker, every one lever is never enough to achieve the objective. Because these levers are attached to rubber, you've got to do multiple things in order to make the system change. And I think you just need to use other methods. So, for example, when we were inviting bids from schools to be, I don't know, a sort of exemplar school in computing or something, I always made sure that if it was a secondary school, that their EBAC figure was certainly above average. And if it was a primary school, that their phonics results were above average. And I got resistance from officials. Say, oh, the phonics results aren't accountability measure. So, well, it is actually. It's just not published. So I had to fight hard for these things. But so that's a lever. So don't bother applying to be this or that if your phonics is below average or below 90 or something. Or don't bother applying if you're. And maybe we didn't do enough of that on the multiplication table check. Maybe I should have also said, unless your school score is above 34%, 100% getting full marks, then you can't apply. So yeah. Oh, I wish I was back there now trying to sort out this problem.
Yeah, and like I said, I don't. I'm possibly been unduly harsh, and perhaps we've got the next couple of years because a lot of the initial years were just disrupted. And in my mind, I think we had Robin Walker, William Quinson, Jonathan Gullis also acting as schools minister for a bit,
Hmm.
and then you came back. So, part of me is thinking if the message got muddied, is that an unfair interpretation? Would have been different had you been minister.
Maybe, but it's only been around. I mean, it's only been compulsory since 2022. So often these things have a slower burn. But as I said, I still think that kids now they are being taught that multiplication tables check. It's like the phonics thing. There's some schools do it better than others, and the next stage is to get all schools to do it in the way the best schools are doing it, and that's why the multi-academy trust system is so good. And I think on that change of ministry thing, I mean, I was out of office between September 2012 and July 2014. I go through the full horror of that leaving office in the book. And but what happened in that period was that the focus on the EBAT diminished, and I became a trustee of a big multi-academy trust in that period. And I saw it from the other angle. I saw head teachers saying to me, "Oh, the government's not that fussed about the EBAT." So these kind of messages of tone and priority really filter through to the system. So I think that was a pity because I think if Michael and I had stayed, I think the EBAC would carry more weight in the system. So we've only really got foreign languages, which is the limiting factor in the EBAC, has only gone from 40% to 46 or something like that. Whereas before they removed the compulsion back in 2004, it was like sort of 70, 80% taking the GCSE in a foreign language. So this messaging issue, which sometimes does get fudged and lost when you change ministerial office, is really important.
That links quite nicely into my last two questions, which are sort of in the what if region. In reforming lessons, you express concern that the current government is dismantling the infrastructure you helped build, that we've discussed throughout this conversation, and the infrastructure that helped England recently climb numerous international league tables. What are the signs you're seeing, and what should teachers be paying attention to as potential red flags?
Well, I worry about the children's wellbeing in schools bill. I think that was a major error by the government. because what they're doing is they're kind of undermining the principle of autonomy of academies, and that's been a big driver of A, standards, and B, the liberation of the profession. Some of the measures in reality won't be as impactful as they might appear, so I don't think the autonomy over the curriculum will have much impact because most academies are already teaching the national curriculum. They have to because they've got the SATs to do and then they've got the GCSEs to do, which they have to under the funding agreement. And they can teach beyond it. No one's going to stop them teaching beyond the national curriculum. So I think that it's a pity they've done that because it sends a message. But what I do worry about are things like that they can prevent a good school from expanding. We made that completely. We said no consultation. If you want to expand, you can expand. Um, and they say now, if a local authority thinks that you're going to diminish the attractiveness of a weaker school, they can stop you expanding. Well, that's a massive error. That whole notion of, if you like, a sort of internal market within the state, you crush it by doing that. It's why the 88 Act didn't really work. Local management of schools didn't really push up standards because everyone was trying to protect the weaker schools from falling roles. So we're going back to that, which is a shame. And then, of course, they also say that they can force schools to expand if the local authority needs more school places and an academy is resisting. Well, I think that's wrong too, because there are some schools like King Solomon that have a quite precious about the size of their school. I think it would undermine their ethos if they were forced to become twice the size. So those things are a pity. The other thing I think probably the biggest mistake of that bill is the notion of a school in special measures, inadequate school with the automatic issuing of an academy order. I think they're getting rid of that, and I think that's that. If you think about the schools for decades have been RI and inadequate, going back and forth between those two gradings, and those schools that become sponsored academies. I mean, the vast majority of those sponsored academies are now good or outstanding. I mean, what's to not like about that policy? So I think again that's a mistake, and I think they've just listened too much to the political discourse around those measures when they were introduced and the views of the National Education Union, rather than have their own vision about how they want to raise standards. So I think that I worry about that aspect of the bill, but I'm optimistic for the future, notwithstanding that bill. But so what should the red flags be for schools? I just think schools do need to protect their autonomy, and if they don't want to expand because they think it would undermine behavior and the ethos, then they need to resist it hard. And if they want to expand because they've got a really great school that is oversubscribed, by 150% or something, why wouldn't you allow it to expand? It's just tragic when you're denying pupils a school place that they could have had. So I think but the legislation will just make sure that we'll just require them to go through the consultation process. I just say we'll just persist with that. But I'm optimistic though, because as I said before about the secret garden, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. Teachers have taken control of their own profession. They are engaged in the intellectual discourse about curriculum and pedagogy and school ethos and behavior, and that will continue. And not only will it continue, it will continue to flourish and grow. So that to me means I think we're going to continue to see higher standards in our schools, notwithstanding some of the things the department's trying to do.
So it's almost the system level changes that will eventually drip down to teachers at some point. And but on your point about the secret garden, I think the delay of the Ofsted reforms, I think in some part have come from teachers speaking out about their concerns and that kind of thing. And I'm really hoping that there's some serious thought given to that over the next couple of months as we move forward.
Yes, I think it was a mistake to remove the one word judgments. It is in a way a slightly blunt accountability measure, but not as blunt as just relying on exam results, which is what will happen if you don't have an inspection system. The inspection system is meant to. This is something that Amanda Spielman was very good about. She's you've got to look at what's happening in the school. Don't just look at the fact that the school results are very high. I mean, the results are important, of course. You can't have a good judgment if your results are through the floor. But there are some schools that, where all the kids in the class all have private tutors, and they could get really good results because of that, rather than what's happening in the school. So I think there is a case for Ofsted, and also it can check on things like safeguarding, and it can check on things like behaviour that's not necessarily reflected in the results. So I think it's important, if you want a proper balanced judgment, to have an Ofsted. But I think the notion of five separate judgments and so on. I think the old system was better. And if I'd been in office, we wouldn't have gone down this route. I know what happened in Caversham. I mean, it was an appalling tragedy. But I think the measures that were taken after that, in terms of how you tackle safeguarding. If you remember, that school had really high academic results. It was a safeguarding way it fell down. And I'm sure safeguarding is really important in a school. You've got young children in this building for several hours a day. And also you need to be able to identify problems happening at home. That's really important. But those issues, I think, can be solved through a different mechanism once they're identified by an Ofsted inspection, in a way that academic standards really take much longer to try and rectify. So but anyway, I think the measures that Amanda put in place after Caversham, I think, were the right ones. I think that could have dealt with those problems, but I think the government's overreacted now, and it became a political issue, and we are where we are.
I think I had maybe 9 Ofsted inspections, or was part of 9 Ofsted inspections during that time. Each one was better than the last, in a more positive, discursive process. Whereas, like, we mentioned before we joined, or before we started recording, that it was learn the dance, do the Ofsted dance, and they go away for 4 years, 5 years, and that kind of thing. And it very much wasn't the case in those later years, So I was very disappointed, because the APP grids that you got rid of when you became schools minister, it feels like the same logic being applied to school inspection. And I think someone said there are maybe 9 million possible outcomes if you were to join all the different kids. So I'm looking forward to it. I'm really hoping that it doesn't. Were you still in government and actively involved in education/schools? What would your priorities look like for the next 10 years? And was there anything left on the table you wish you had the opportunity to develop or implement? We've almost touched on that a little bit as we've gone through.
Yes, I mean, I do wish the phonics results were higher. I mean, decoding is not everything to reading, but it is a necessary condition for reading. And there ought not to be, and there's a gap between disadvantaged and advantaged children, about 10 percentage points. There shouldn't be a gap. This is a mechanical exercise. It's not dependent on home life and going to the theatre and having books at home. It's just how well it's taught. And I think a lot of poor teaching is concealed by children who learn at home and do well in the test, but the children who don't learn at home, who are in that school, do badly. And they shouldn't be doing badly. They should, if it was well taught. So I would continue to push that, so we get that figure up to the late 90s for both disadvantage and disadvantage. I wanted to make the disadvantage figure the key target number that Ofsted looked at, not the overall figure. So there's that. I was worried about Key Stage 3. I don't think, with the curriculum, if you look at the national curriculum, you'll see that the Key Stage 1 and 2 is very detailed in maths, English and science, not so detailed in geography and history. And at Key Stage 3, none of it is very detailed, very high level. That was a debate that we had within our own ranks about what it should look like. And I think it should be more detailed, frankly, at Key Stage 3. I think we've had. The other thing that worries me about Key Stage 3 is the way in year 7 and 8 we're teaching this literature, that we're teaching 12-year-olds to answer questions suitable to a 15 or 16-year-old at GCSE. I think that's a mistake. I think that's one of the reasons why we do so badly in the love of reading in the PISA studies. I think what should happen at year 7 is that you just teach children, you introduce them to harder books than they were used to in primary, move away from David Walliams and Michael Morpurgo and start to read some of the more challenging books for young adults, and some of the easier classics, and just make sure children understand what they're reading. Don't do this textual analysis at that age. So you introduce them to harder books so they can read themselves, and you're trying to develop a love of literature. So I think I'd like to have done something on that. And then I started to dip my toe into sport. I just kept noticing the difference in sport in the state sector from the independent sector. And you drive by a school and you see these rugby posts, or football goal posts in a pitch. And then you drive by the school and you see nobody playing, and you drive by again and nobody playing. You see, well, and then I remember going to vote in my local village hall, and I went into the vote. As I approached, the school was still operating. There was a PE lesson happening in the playing fields. The kids were all sitting on the grass listening to the PE teacher. Went in to vote, said hello to the returning officer, blah, blah, blah. Came out about 5 or 6 minutes later. The kids were still sitting on the grass listening to the PE teacher. I thought that isn't PE. That's some kind of scientific thing or something or other. So I was dipping my toe into that, and I did discover that it's very, very ideological again, like phonics. I ran out of time to tackle that issue, but I think we need children. Of course, they need the skills of learning how all these different sports, whether it's rugby, football, whatever. But they need to be exercising regularly for their long-term health, and to inculcate the habit of exercise to young people. So I like to have done something on that. And then things like music. I was always passionate about improving the quality of music. We had a model music curriculum that was great, 2 year exercise, headed by Veronica Wadley and people like Ed Watkins and Julian Lloyd Webber on that group. I'd like to see that more embedded in, particularly in primary schools, so children learn how to read and write music and so on. So these sound like peripheral issues, sport and music, but actually they're not. Um, I think that the schools that do well in those subjects do well academically. So there we are. Those are some things I wish I'd had more time to do.
And a return to politics totally off the cards? Are you going to enjoy your retirement?
I think so. Well, I'm not really retired, with Frank. I mean, I'm out of politics. I'm glad not to be an MP. I really miss being a minister. I miss the red box, which other ministers find surprising because that's the terror of most ministers. But the red box is where you make policy, and I just loved it. I spend my whole weekends up from 5 a.m. Going through it, and each one was a delight. But so I miss that. I don't miss the House of Commons at all. I love the debate. I don't mind. I love taking part in the Chambers debate. What I don't like is the hanging around and all the kind of factionalism and the who's up, who's down, and let's plot to make me leader or this person leader, and you join my gang. Awful, all that stuff, hideous. So I'm glad to be away from that. But no, I think I worry about where politics is heading, frankly. I think the mainstream parties have lost the plot. They're too busy thinking they need to behave like an episode of In the Thick of It. That isn't politics as it should be. Politics is about ideas. It's about serving your community, about not being cynical about politics, about being serious about issues and ideas. And I remember writing in 2001 at the Times about this issue. I said then that politicians have got to not play the Yabu red versus blue game, because there are lots of things Labour does that are great. They invented Teach First, they brought Teach First to our country. All kinds of great things they did in education that we then built on, and they had built on what we had done. But there's some terrible things Conservatives have done, and some great things. So I think you've got to be. I just think people should be less Yabu and more serious about debating the issues about our country and how it should be run. And I said that in 2001. If the mainstream parties aren't authentic and honest in their deliberations, the public will get their authenticity and they will get their honesty. And if the mainstream parties won't deliver it, they'll get it from elsewhere. And that's precisely what's happening now. They're flocking in the developed world to populist, generally right-wing, extremist parties. And then they'll get into power and they'll mess it up. And then they'll all flock to the extremist left-wing parties. So I worry. And I just think mainstream parties have got to just be better at what they do. And not being party political now, didn't want to be, but I am disappointed by the current government. I wish they were just better. I want them to succeed, you know. And I just don't think they've done enough preparation in opposition. And that's a shame. But they've got to get that together. And I'm rooting for them to do so because we cannot have, well, anyway, there we are. We just mustn't move to the populist parties in any part of the developed world. We've got to get, but you know, it's the mainstream. You probably want to cut all this nonsense, but the mainstream parties are they are to blame. They've got to get that together, take politics seriously, take their country seriously, and then they'll start to, you know, to earn back the support and respect of the electorate.
Yeah, no, I don't consider myself to have any political allegiances, but I've been disappointed too, certainly from an education perspective. So, I think you're absolutely right in terms of they must be better and they must, like you said, that attention to detail that you had a long time ago and I presumably still do, um, is essential. I think lots of our listeners will owe you a huge debt of gratitude for the changes you've made over the last 10 to 15 years. And all the set to do is say thank you very much for joining me. I really, really appreciate it.
Well, I enjoyed speaking to you. Thank you very much for having me on.
And everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.